Picture a father looking at his own child with disgust, telling her daily that her skin is too dark, that she's a stain on the family name. Now imagine a towering stranger seeing that same girl and declaring her the most beautiful thing he's ever laid eyes on. This is the story of Isabella Martinez, caught between a father's poison and a cowboy's truth. The question that would shatter everything wasn't about beauty or ugliness. It was about which man truly saw her and why that recognition would change 3 lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Texas sun had barely kissed the horizon when 16-year-old Isabella Martinez crept through the silent hallways of her family's ranch house outside San Antonio. The wooden floors, worn smooth by 3 generations of Martinez boots, knew exactly which boards would betray her with their groaning protests. She had memorized every safe step, every quiet corner, every shadow that could hide her from her father's morning ritual of reminding her exactly what God had cursed their bloodline with when she was born. The bathroom at the end of the hall had become her sanctuary, and her torment in equal measure. Unlike the other mirrors throughout the house, which her father, Carlos Martinez, had systematically covered with dark cloth, this one remained exposed, a small act of rebellion that Isabella had never understood until now. Perhaps her mother, Elena, had fought to keep this single reflection available, knowing that a girl needed to see herself, even if what she saw contradicted everything she was told about her appearance. Isabella stood before the mirror in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the face that had been called too dark, too Indian, too much like her mother's people, and not enough like the Martinez side that Carlos was so proud of. What she saw reflected back was a heart-shaped face with prominent cheekbones that caught the light like carved stone, creating shadows and highlights that seemed almost artistic in their arrangement. Her skin was indeed darker than her father's olive complexion, a rich bronze that spoke of her mother's Cherokee and Mexican heritage. Warm and luminous like polished copper in the right light, her eyes were large and expressive, so dark brown they appeared almost black in certain light, framed by thick lashes that curved upward naturally. Her hair fell in heavy waves past her shoulders, black as a moonless night, with threads of mahogany that appeared when the sun hit it directly. Her lips were full and naturally rose-colored, and her nose was straight with just a slight upturn that her grandmother had called proud. But Carlos Martinez saw none of this beauty. When he looked at Isabella, he saw everything he had tried to escape from his own mixed heritage, everything that reminded him of the poverty and prejudice he had fought so hard to leave behind. He saw his wife's face, the woman he had loved and lost, and with that love had died his ability to see beauty in the features they shared. The sound of heavy boots on the stairs sent Isabella scurrying back to her room, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. She had learned to move like a ghost in this house, to make herself invisible when Carlos's mood darkened, which seemed to happen more frequently as she grew older and began to resemble Elena more closely. Isabella. Carlos's voice boomed through the house, carrying the particular edge that meant he was already angry about something, and she would bear the brunt of it.
Get down here and make yourself useful.
The coffee isn't going to make itself, and I've got work to do. She dressed quickly, in the plain brown dress that Carlos had chosen for her, one of several identical dresses in muted colors that he claimed were appropriate for someone who shouldn't draw attention to herself. The dress was well made, but deliberately chosen to minimize any attractive qualities she might possess. It hung loose on her developing figure, and the color washed out her natural warmth, making her appear sickly rather than vibrant. The kitchen was already thick with tension when Isabella entered. Carlos sat at the head of the scarred wooden table that had served the Martinez family for decades, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that looked tiny in his massive grip. At 52, Carlos Martinez was still an imposing figure, 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by decades of ranch work, his black hair now streaked with premature silver, his face lined by sun and stress in equal measure. He had built the Martinez Ranch into one of the most successful operations in South Texas. Through sheer force of will and an obsessive drive to prove that he was more than the half-breed, the other ranchers had called him in his youth. Every acre purchased, every head of cattle added to his herds, every improvement made to the property was ammunition in his lifelong war against the prejudice that had shaped his early years. But success had come at a cost that Isabella was only beginning to understand. Carlos had married Elena Blackhorse partly for love, but also because her family owned adjacent land that he wanted to acquire. When she died in childbirth complications 3 years later, leaving behind a daughter who carried more of her features than his, Carlos saw it as a cruel joke played by fate. All his efforts to elevate the Martinez name and his own daughter looked like she belonged with Eleanor's people rather than his. "You're moving like molasses," Carlos observed as Isabella busied herself at the stove, preparing his breakfast with the efficiency born of years of practice. "A woman needs to be quick and useful, especially one who doesn't have looks working in her favor." Isabella's hands didn't pause in their work, but something inside her chest tightened with familiar pain. These casual cruelties were as much a part of her morning routine as making coffee or gathering eggs from the henhouse. Carlos delivered them without particular malice, as if he were simply stating facts about the weather or the price of cattle. "Your skin's getting darker," he continued, studying her with the critical eye of a man examining livestock. "All this summer sun, I've told you to stay inside during the heat of the day, but you don't listen. No man wants a wife who looks like she's been working in the fields all her life." The irony was lost on Carlos that his own skin was nearly as dark as Isabella's, bronzed by decades of outdoor work. But somehow on him it looked rugged and masculine. On his daughter he saw only the features that marked her as different from the Anglo families he desperately wanted to be accepted by. Isabella set his breakfast before him, eggs over easy, thick slices of bacon, biscuits made from her grandmother's recipe, and fresh butter she had churned herself. The meal was prepared perfectly, but Carlos found fault anyway. "These biscuits are too dense," he said, after taking a single bite. "Your grandmother could make biscuits that were light as air, but I suppose that's another skill that didn't get passed down to you." The truth was that Isabella's biscuits were exceptional, light, flaky, and buttery in exactly the way Carlos preferred them. But acknowledging her skill would mean acknowledging her worth, and Carlos had convinced himself that praising Isabella would only make her prideful and difficult to manage. As Carlos ate in disapproving silence, Isabella moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, cleaning up after his meal while simultaneously preparing ingredients for lunch. She had been managing the household since she was 12 years old, taking over duties that had once belonged to Eleanor and the housekeeper Carlos had let go after his wife's death to save money. She cooked, cleaned, managed the kitchen garden, preserved food for winter, and handled the household accounts with a mathematical precision that would have impressed anyone who bothered to notice. But Carlos saw only what he chose to see, a daughter who was too dark, too much like her mother, too likely to bring shame to the Martinez name if she ever ventured beyond their property lines. The morning routine continued with Carlos listing the day's tasks, most of which would fall to Isabella, despite the fact that she was already managing more responsibility than most adult women. The vegetable garden needed weeding. The laundry needed washing, 3 sick calves required nursing, and the fence line along the south pasture needed checking for breaks. "And stay away from the main road," Carlos added, as he prepared to leave for his own work in the fields. "There's been talk of travelers passing through, and I don't need anyone getting ideas about helping themselves to what doesn't belong to them." The warning was delivered with particular emphasis, and Isabella understood that Carlos wasn't just concerned about thieves. He was worried about someone seeing her, forming opinions about her, or worse, showing interest in her. In Carlos's worldview, any attention Isabella received would reflect poorly on the family, would remind people that the Martinez bloodline wasn't as pure as he pretended it to be. As the sun climbed higher and the Texas heat began to build, Isabella worked through her endless list of chores with the mechanical precision of someone whose value was measured entirely by productivity. The vegetable garden behind the house was her pride and joy. Though Carlos dismissed it as women's work and rarely acknowledged the significant contribution it made to their household expenses. Under Isabella's care, the garden had become a masterpiece of organization and abundance. Neat rows of tomatoes, beans, squash, and peppers stretched in carefully planned arrangements that maximized both space and yield. She had inherited her mother's intuitive understanding of plants and soil, combined with knowledge passed down from her grandmother about indigenous growing techniques that worked better than traditional methods in the harsh Texas climate. But even here, in this space where her competence was undeniable, Carlos found ways to undermine her confidence. "Those tomatoes are too small," he would say, ignoring the fact that the variety Isabella had chosen was specifically selected for its disease resistance and ability to produce consistently in extreme heat. "Your mother grew tomatoes twice that size." Isabella had learned not to point out that Elena had died when Isabella was only 3 years old, making Carlos's memories of his wife's gardening skills highly suspect. She had also learned not to mention that their neighbors frequently commented on the exceptional quality of her produce, or that Mrs. Patterson at the general store had offered to buy her surplus vegetables for resale to families in town. Any acknowledgement of Isabella's skills or accomplishments seemed to trigger something dark in Carlos, as if her success was somehow a threat to his authority or a judgment on his own abilities. It was safer to let him believe that she was as incompetent as he claimed, even when the evidence of her capabilities surrounded them every day. The afternoon brought a brief respite when Isabella was sent to check the fence line along the south pasture. This task took her away from the house and Carlos's constant criticism, allowing her to walk among the cattle and enjoy the vast openness of the Texas landscape without commentary about her appearance or character. She loved these moments of solitude, when she could appreciate the beauty of the land without being reminded of her supposed ugliness. The rolling hills covered in native grass, the scattered oak trees that provided shade for the cattle, the endless sky that stretched from horizon to horizon. This was the Texas she had fallen in love with. Even as she dreamed of escaping it, Isabella had never been allowed to attend school beyond the 8th grade. Carlos claimed that too much education made women difficult and gave them ideas above their station. What he really feared was that education would give Isabella options, would show her that there was a world beyond the Martinez ranch where her worth might be measured by something other than her skin color and her father's approval. But Isabella had educated herself in secret, borrowing books from the small library in town during the rare occasions when Carlos allowed her to accompany him on supply runs. She read voraciously, novels, histories, books about other places where people like her might find acceptance. She dreamed of cities where diversity was celebrated rather than hidden, of opportunities that might await someone with her skills and determination. These dreams were dangerous, and she kept them locked away in the deepest corners of her heart. Carlos had made it clear that her future lay in marriage to someone who would be grateful enough for a wife that her defects wouldn't matter. He had already begun making inquiries about potential husbands, older men, widowers with children, men whose own limitations would make them less particular about their wives' appearance. The thought of such a marriage filled Isabella with quiet despair. She had witnessed enough loveless unions to understand what awaited women who were treated as burdens to be disposed of rather than partners to be cherished. She would cook and clean and bear children for a man who saw her as a duty rather than a gift. and her dreams of something more would slowly die in the face of daily indifference. As she walked the fence line, checking for breaks that could allow cattle to wander onto neighboring property, Isabella allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life. What would it feel like to be seen as beautiful? What would it be like to have someone look at her with admiration rather than disgust? What kind of man would see past her father's poisonous characterizations to appreciate her intelligence, her skills, her capacity for love? These thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider was coming up the dirt road that led to the Martinez ranch, moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than mere passing through. Isabella's first instinct was to hide, remembering Carlos's warnings about staying away from strangers, but curiosity overcame caution. The rider was still too far away to see clearly. But even at this distance, Isabella could tell he was large, unusually so, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun behind him. As he drew closer, she realized that this was no ordinary traveler. This was a giant of a man, tall enough that his feet nearly touched the ground, even while mounted on a horse that was itself above average size. Isabella knew she should return to the house immediately, should report the stranger's approach to Carlos, and let him handle whatever business brought the man to their property. But something about the rider's unhurried confidence, the way he sat his horse like he belonged in the saddle, the sense of calm strength he projected even from a distance, made her hesitate. For the first time in her 16 years, Isabella Martinez was about to meet someone who would see her not as Carlos's shameful secret, but as Elena's beautiful daughter. She had no way of knowing that this encounter would change everything, would challenge every lie she had been told about herself, would offer her a choice between the familiar prison of her father's making and the terrifying possibility of freedom. But as the giant cowboy drew closer, his face becoming visible beneath the brim of his hat, Isabella felt something stir in her chest that she had never experienced before. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, life-changing hope. The afternoon was about to become the first day of the rest of her life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Bear Sullivan had been riding hard for 3 days straight, pushing his massive frame and his equally impressive horse across the Texas plains with the kind of determination that came from a man running towards something rather than away from it. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and built like the oak trees that dotted the landscape, Bear was the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went, not just because of his size, but because of the gentle way he moved through the world, as if he were constantly aware that his presence might intimidate and took pains to soften it. His horse, a 17-hand bay gelding named Thunder, was one of the few animals strong enough to carry Bear's considerable weight across long distances without complaint. The horse had been specially bred in Montana by a rancher who understood that some men required more substantial mounts, and Bear had paid a premium price for an animal that could match his unusual proportions. Bear's destination was the Martinez Ranch, though he didn't know it by that name yet. All he knew was that Jonas Fletcher, a cattle broker out of Houston, had told him about a successful rancher in this area who might be looking for experienced help with an upcoming cattle drive. The pay was good, the work was honest, and Bear was in need of both steady employment and a place to settle for longer than the few weeks or months that characterized most of his recent jobs. At 32, Thomas Sullivan had spent the better part of his adult life moving from ranch to ranch, never quite finding the combination of good work, decent people, and a place that felt like home. His size made him valuable for certain types of labor. He could lift what other men couldn't, could handle difficult horses that intimidated smaller riders, could work longer hours without the physical toll that broke down other cowboys. But his size also made him a curiosity, sometimes a threat. always different in ways that prevented him from forming the deep connections he craved. Bear had learned to read people quickly, to distinguish between those who saw his physical presence as an asset and those who saw it as something to be feared or exploited. He had worked for ranchers who treated him like a prized bull, valuable for his strength but not quite human in their estimation. He had also worked for men who appreciated not just his physical capabilities, but his intelligence, his way with animals, and his natural leadership abilities. The best job he'd ever had was working for the Riverside Ranch in Colorado, where the owner, Daniel Riverside, had treated Bear like family rather than hired help. For 2 years, Bear had thought he'd found his permanent home, a place where his contributions were valued and his differences celebrated rather than merely tolerated. But Daniel's death in a riding accident had left the ranch to relatives who saw Bear as an unnecessary expense, and he'd been forced to move on once again. Now, as he approached what appeared to be a prosperous ranch with well-maintained buildings and healthy-looking cattle, Bear felt the familiar mixture of hope and caution that accompanied each new opportunity. The property showed signs of good management, fences were in good repair, pastures were well maintained, and the main house, while not elaborate, had the solid, cared-for appearance of a family homestead. What caught Bear's attention immediately was the garden behind the main house. Even from a distance, he could see that someone with real skill had designed and maintained the vegetable plots. The rows were perfectly straight, the plants were thriving despite the Texas heat, and the overall layout showed both practical knowledge and artistic sensibility. In Bear's experience, a well-tended garden was often the sign of a household where attention to detail and pride in work were valued, good indicators for potential employment. As he rode closer to the main house, Bear noticed a figure working along the fence line of the south pasture. The person appeared to be checking for breaks or damage, moving with the efficient purpose of someone who knew their work and took it seriously. Bear altered his course slightly, thinking it would be polite to announce his presence to whoever was working the property before approaching the main house. As the distance closed, Bear realized that the figure was a young woman, and his first impression was of graceful competence. She moved along the fence line with practiced ease, her attention focused on her task, her movements economical and purposeful. When she noticed his approach and turned toward him, Bear felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so immediate and powerful that it took his breath away. Isabella Martinez was beautiful in a way that made Bear forget every conventional standard of beauty he had ever been taught to value. Her bronze skin seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, creating a warmth and luminosity that made her appear almost otherworldly. Her dark eyes were large and expressive, holding depths of intelligence and feeling that suggested a rich inner life. Her black hair, caught by the breeze, moved like silk around a face that belonged in a painting. But what struck Bear most powerfully was not just her physical beauty, but the way she carried herself. Despite her obvious youth, he guessed she was in her mid-teens. There was a dignity about her, a quiet strength that spoke of someone who had learned to rely on herself. She reminded him immediately of his own mother, Maria Elena Sullivan, a Mexican woman who had married his Irish father and raised Bear to appreciate the beauty and strength that came from mixed heritage. Bear's mother had faced prejudice for her mixed-race marriage and for raising a son who would grow to unusual size. But she had never allowed that prejudice to diminish her sense of self-worth or her pride in her cultural heritage. She had taught Bear to see beauty in diversity, to value strength in all its forms, and to recognize that sometimes the most extraordinary people were those who had been told they were ordinary. Looking at Isabella now, Bear saw echoes of his mother's quiet dignity, her graceful strength, her natural beauty that seemed to shine from within. He also saw something else, a wariness in the young woman's posture that suggested she was not used to being approached by strangers, particularly men, and that such encounters might not typically go well for her. Bear dismounted from Thunder while still at a respectful distance, not wanting his imposing height to seem threatening. Even standing on the ground, he was tall enough that he had to look down at Isabella. But he was careful to keep his posture relaxed and non-threatening. "Afternoon, miss," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that had been drilled into him by his mother from earliest childhood. "I'm Thomas Sullivan, though most folks call me Bear. I'm looking for the owner of this ranch. Heard he might be hiring experienced hands." Isabella's first instinct was to direct him to the main house and escape as quickly as possible. Carlos's warnings about staying away from strangers echoed in her mind, along with years of conditioning that told her to make herself invisible whenever possible. But something about this giant man's demeanor made her hesitate. His voice was gentle despite his size, his posture respectful rather than commanding. And there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before when men looked at her, instead of the disgust or indifference she expected. Bear's eyes held what appeared to be genuine admiration, not the hungry, predatory look that sometimes made her uncomfortable during rare trips to town, but something warmer and more respectful, as if he were looking at something precious and beautiful and feeling grateful for the opportunity to see it. "You'll want to speak with my father, Carlos Martinez," Isabella said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "He owns the ranch. He should be in the north pasture checking on the cattle." "Much obliged," Bear replied, but he didn't immediately move to leave. Instead, he seemed to be studying her with the same attention he might give to a fine horse or a piece of craftsmanship. "That's some impressive garden work back there," he added, nodding toward the vegetable plots behind the house. "Takes real skill to get plants to thrive like that in this heat." The compliment caught Isabella off guard. Carlos never acknowledged her gardening abilities, and most people who saw the garden assumed it was maintained by hired help, or perhaps Isabella's mother. Having her work recognized and praised by a stranger felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's just vegetables. Nothing fancy? Nothing fancy?" Bear's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Miss, I've worked ranches from Montana to Mexico, and I've never seen a more skillfully laid-out garden. The way you've arranged those plants to provide shade for each other, the way you've positioned everything to make the most of the available water, that's the work of someone who really understands plants and soil." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but for once, it wasn't the flush of shame she was accustomed to. This was the warmth of pride, of having her work truly seen and appreciated by someone who understood its value. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had praised her efforts, let alone with such obvious sincerity. "You know about gardening?" she asked, her natural curiosity overcoming her trained wariness. Bear's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. Where his size might have made him intimidating, his smile revealed the gentle soul beneath the imposing exterior. "My mother taught me," he said. "She could grow anything, anywhere. Used to say plants could sense whether you cared about them, and they'd respond accordingly. Looking at your garden, I'd say your plants know they're loved." The word loved hit Isabella like a physical touch. No one had ever suggested that her work came from love, or that love could be something visible in the results of that work. Carlos saw her gardening as necessary drudgery, a way to keep her occupied and contribute to the household economy. The idea that her care for the plants, her attention to their needs, her pleasure in watching them grow and thrive, might be a form of love that others could recognize was revolutionary. "What else did your mother teach you?" Isabella found herself asking, then immediately worried that the question was too personal, too forward for someone she had just met. But Bear seemed delighted by her interest. "Everything important," he said without hesitation. "How to see beauty in things other people might overlook. How to treat people with respect regardless of what they look like or where they come from. How to judge a person by their character rather than their circumstances." He paused, studying Isabella's face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow didn't. She taught me that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who've been told they're ordinary. And she taught me to recognize a masterpiece when I see one. The last words were spoken so quietly that Isabella almost wasn't sure she had heard them correctly. But the way Bear was looking at her, with a reverence that seemed almost religious in its intensity, left no doubt about his meaning. He was calling her a masterpiece, her Isabella Martinez, the girl who was too dark, too much like her mother's people, too far from the Anglo ideal that Carlos worshipped. "I don't understand," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind through the grass. "Don't understand what?" Bear asked gently. "Why you're looking at me like that? Why you're saying these things?" Isabella's voice gained strength as confusion mixed with a desperate need to understand. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." Bear was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. He could see that his compliments were affecting this young woman powerfully, but he could also see that they were confusing her, as if praise were a foreign language she had never learned to speak. "You're right," he said finally. "I don't know you, but I know what I see when I look at you. I see intelligence in your eyes, kindness in the way you tend your garden, strength in the way you carry yourself. I see a young woman who's been told lies about her worth for so long that she's forgotten how to recognize the truth." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "What truth?" "That you're beautiful," Bear said simply. "Not just pretty, not just pleasant to look at, but genuinely beautiful in a way that makes a man forget what he was thinking about before he saw you. Beautiful like your mother must have been if you got those looks from her." The reference to Elena hit Isabella like a lightning strike. No one ever mentioned her mother, especially not in positive terms. Carlos had buried Elena's memory along with everything else that reminded him of the heritage he wanted to forget. Hearing this stranger speak of her mother's beauty as if it were something to be celebrated rather than hidden felt like finding water in a desert. "You look like her," Bear continued, not knowing how significant his words were. "I can tell just by looking at you." She must have been something special to have passed on beauty like that. Tears began to gather in Isabella's eyes, and she blinked rapidly to keep them from falling. "My father says I'm too dark," she said quietly. "He says my skin makes me unmarriageable. He says I look too much like my mother's people and not enough like his." Bear's expression darkened with something that might have been anger, but when he spoke, his voice remained gentle. "Your father's wrong," he said with absolute conviction. "Dead wrong. Your skin is beautiful. It's the color of warm honey, of polished bronze, of every sunset I've ever seen that took my breath away. Any man who can't see the beauty in that is blind, and any father who would tell his daughter she's unmarriageable because of the color of her skin is a fool." The words hit Isabella like a series of physical blows, but instead of pain, they brought a strange lightness, as if some crushing weight she had carried for years was suddenly being lifted from her shoulders. For 16 years, she had accepted Carlos's assessment of her appearance as objective truth. Hearing someone challenge that assessment, hearing someone describe her coloring in terms of beauty rather than shame, created a crack in the foundation of everything she believed about herself. "But he's my father," she said weakly, as if this fact should make his opinions automatically correct. "Being a father doesn't make a man right about everything," Bear replied. "Sometimes fathers are wrong. Sometimes they're so wrapped up in their own fears and prejudices that they can't see their children clearly. And sometimes, miss, they're just plain cruel." The last word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Isabella wasn't quite ready to examine. The idea that Carlos might be cruel rather than simply honest, that his daily criticisms might be motivated by something other than concern for her welfare, was too big and too dangerous to fully consider. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. Carlos Martinez was riding hard across the pasture, his face dark with an anger that Isabella recognized immediately. He had seen his daughter talking to a stranger, and there would be consequences for this deviation from his rules. Bear straightened to his full, impressive height, but his hands remained relaxed at his sides, and his expression remained calm. Isabella, however, felt familiar panic rising in her chest. Whatever punishment Carlos had in mind for this transgression would be made worse by the fact that the stranger had complimented her, had treated her with respect, had suggested that she was something other than the burden Carlos believed her to be. As Carlos approached, Bear found himself studying the man who had managed to convince a daughter like Isabella that she was anything less than extraordinary. What he saw was a man of middle years, weathered by work and hardened by disappointment, whose own mixed heritage was clearly visible in his features. The irony was not lost on Bear. Carlos Martinez shared many of the same characteristics he apparently despised in his daughter, suggesting that his prejudice was born not from genuine conviction, but from self-hatred turned outward. The confrontation that was about to unfold would force all three of them to confront truths they had been avoiding, and would set in motion events that would change Isabella's life forever. But as Carlos bore down on them, with fury blazing in his eyes, Bear Sullivan stood his ground and prepared to defend a young woman whose worth her own father had failed to recognize. The battle for Isabella Martinez's soul was about to begin. Carlos Martinez brought his horse to a sliding stop just feet from where Bear and Isabella stood, the animal's hooves throwing up dust that hung in the still afternoon air like a physical manifestation of the tension crackling between the three figures. At 52, Carlos was still an imposing man, but standing next to Thomas Sullivan, he appeared almost diminished, not just by Bear's extraordinary height, but by something less tangible, a presence that seemed to fill the space around the giant cowboy. Isabella! Carlos's voice cut through the air like a whip crack, carrying all the authority of 16 years of unquestioned dominance over his daughter's life. Get to the house, now. But for the first time in her memory, Isabella didn't immediately obey. The words Bear had spoken to her, about her beauty, about her father being wrong, about her resembling her mother, had created something new inside her chest, a tiny spark of defiance that she had never known she possessed. Instead of running, she remained frozen in place, torn between years of conditioning and this new, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to accept her father's version of reality. Bear, meanwhile, calmly replaced his hat and extended his hand toward Carlos in a gesture of respectful introduction. "Afternoon, Mr. Martinez, I'm Thomas Sullivan. I understand you might be looking for experienced ranch hands. Jonas Fletcher down in Houston suggested I ride out and speak with you about possible work." Carlos ignored the offered handshake, his dark eyes moving suspiciously between Bear and Isabella, cataloging every detail of their interaction, searching for signs of impropriety or disrespect. What he saw in his daughter's face, a flush of color that might have been excitement rather than shame, eyes that held something resembling hope, made his jaw clench with barely controlled fury. "What did you say to her?" Carlos demanded, his accent thickening the way it always did when his emotions ran high. "What lies did you fill her head with?" Bear's eyebrows rose slightly at the hostile tone, but his voice remained steady and respectful. "I complimented her garden work, sir. It's exceptional, and I may have mentioned that she reminds me of my mother, a woman I considered the most beautiful I ever knew." The words hit Carlos like physical blows. Beautiful, this stranger had called his daughter beautiful, had compared her to his own mother in terms of praise rather than shame. Everything Carlos had worked for 16 years to suppress, Isabella's growing confidence, her natural beauty, her resemblance to Elena, was being brought into the light by a man who had known her for all of 10 minutes. "My daughter is not beautiful," Carlos said, his voice low and dangerous. "My daughter is marked by blood that makes her unsuitable for decent society. Any man who tells her otherwise is either lying to get something from her or too ignorant to understand what he's looking at." Isabella gasped as if she had been slapped. Hearing her father's assessment of her, delivered so bluntly to a stranger, stated as if it were indisputable fact rather than opinion, brought home the full scope of his cruelty in a way that his daily criticisms somehow hadn't. This wasn't just about protecting her or managing her expectations. This was about convincing everyone, including strangers, that she was fundamentally defective. Bear's expression shifted subtly, his easy friendliness replaced by something harder and more dangerous. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that made Carlos's bluster sound hollow by comparison. "Sir, I've been working ranches for 15 years, and I've met a lot of different kinds of men. I've learned to tell the difference between those who build people up and those who tear them down. Right now, I'm looking at a man who's spent so much time tearing down his own daughter that he can't see what's right in front of him." Carlos's face flushed dark with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about, boy. You don't know this family, don't know our circumstances." "I know enough," Bear interrupted, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge that suggested Carlos should think carefully about his next words. "I know that young lady over there has created one of the finest gardens I've seen in 3 states. I know she carries herself with dignity and grace. I know she has intelligent eyes and a kind manner. And I know she's got skin the color of warm honey and features that would make sculptors weep with envy." "Shut your mouth," Carlos snarled, taking a step toward Bear despite the significant size difference between them. "You know nothing about what she is, what she represents. What she represents." Bear's voice rose slightly, his careful control beginning to slip. "She's a 16-year-old girl who deserves to be cherished by her father, not torn down by him. She represents hope and beauty and everything good in this world. And if you can't see that, then you're the one with the problem." The confrontation was escalating quickly, and Isabella watched with fascination and terror as 2 completely different worldviews clashed before her eyes. Carlos represented everything she had ever known about her place in the world, that she was flawed, unmarriageable, a burden to be managed and eventually disposed of. Bear represented something she had never dared to imagine, that she might be worthy of admiration, that her heritage might be something to celebrate rather than hide, that someone might look at her and see beauty rather than defect. "She's too dark," Carlos said, as if this settled the matter once and for all. "Her skin marks her as inferior. No respectable man will want her as a wife. She'll end up with some poor farmer or tradesman who can't afford to be particular about bloodlines." Bear stared at Carlos for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like pity. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly across the space between them. "Mr. Martinez, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. When you look in a mirror, what do you see?" Carlos jerked back as if he had been struck. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one," Bear replied, "because from where I'm standing, you and your daughter share a lot of the same coloring. Your skin is nearly as dark as hers, your features show the same mixed heritage. So either you think you're inferior too, or you're applying a standard to her that you don't apply to yourself." The observation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Carlos's entire sense of self was built on the fantasy that he had successfully elevated himself above his mixed heritage, that his success as a rancher had somehow bleached away the blood he shared with Isabella. Having a stranger point out the hypocrisy of his position, the impossibility of condemning his daughter for traits they shared, threatened the carefully constructed narrative that allowed him to function. "That's different," Carlos said weakly. "I'm a man. I've made something of myself, and what's stopping her from making something of herself?" Bear challenged. "What's stopping her from being everything you are and more, except the poison you've been feeding her about her own worth?" Isabella found herself holding her breath, waiting for her father's response to this question that cut to the heart of everything wrong with their relationship. For 16 years, Carlos had insisted that her limitations were inherent, built into her genetics and her gender. Having someone suggest that her limitations were actually imposed by Carlos himself was revolutionary. "You don't understand the world we live in," Carlos said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "You don't understand the prejudice, the judgment." "I understand it better than you think," Bear replied firmly. "My mother was Mexican, my father was Irish. I grew up knowing exactly what it felt like to be caught between worlds, to have people judge me based on my blood rather than my character. The difference is, my parents taught me that my mixed heritage was a strength, not a weakness. They taught me to be proud of who I was, instead of ashamed." He turned slightly to include Isabella in his gaze, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Your daughter has the same heritage, the same strength. She could conquer the world if someone would just stop telling her she's too broken to try." Carlos looked between Bear and Isabella, seeing something in his daughter's expression that filled him with panic. For the first time in years, Isabella was looking at him not with the resigned acceptance he had trained into her, but with something that looked dangerously like judgment. She was hearing Carlos's words through Bear's ears, seeing his treatment of her through Bear's eyes, and recognizing it for what it truly was. "Isabella," Carlos said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that she had never heard before. "You know I only want what's best for you. You know I'm trying to protect you from disappointment." "No," Isabella said quietly, the words surprising all three of them. "You're not protecting me. You're destroying me." The accusation hung in the air like thunder after lightning, reverberating with years of suppressed pain and newly discovered truth. Isabella had never spoken to her father this way, had never contradicted him so directly, had never named the damage he had inflicted on her psyche. Carlos's face went white, then flushed red with fury. "How dare you speak to me that way? After everything I've sacrificed for you, after all the work I've done to build this ranch, to give you a home." "A home?" Isabella's voice grew stronger, fed by Bear's presence and his absolute conviction in her worth. "This isn't a home. This is a prison, where I'm told every day that I'm worthless, where I'm forbidden from school, from friends, from any chance at happiness. You haven't built me a home, Papa. You've built me a cage." The word "Papa," spoken with such pain and accusation, seemed to hit Carlos harder than any of her other words. This was his little girl, the child he had raised from infancy, and she was looking at him like he was a stranger, a monster, an enemy. "You're being dramatic," Carlos said weakly. "You're letting this stranger fill your head with foolish ideas." "He's not filling my head with anything," Isabella interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "He's just telling me the truth. The truth you've been hiding from me for 16 years. Bear had remained silent during this exchange, recognizing that this was a conversation Isabella needed to have with her father, a reckoning that had been building for years. But as he watched the young woman find her voice, watched her stand up to the man who had systematically destroyed her confidence, he felt a mixture of pride and protectiveness that took his breath away. The truth. Carlos laughed bitterly. "The truth is that he'll use you and leave you. The truth is that men like him see girls like you as temporary amusement. The truth is that when he's finished with you, you'll be ruined for any decent man who might have been willing to overlook your defects." "That's enough," Bear said, his voice carrying a finality that made Carlos step back involuntarily. "You can insult me all you want, but I won't stand here and listen to you destroy your daughter's soul with your poison." He turned to Isabella, his expression gentling as he looked at her. "Miss Martinez, I want you to know something. I want you to remember it every day for the rest of your life. You are beautiful. You are worthy of love. You deserve to be cherished and respected and treated like the treasure you are. Don't let anyone, not even your father, convince you otherwise." Carlos made a sound of rage and stepped toward Bear with his fists clenched. But the size difference between them was so dramatic that the gesture looked more pathetic than threatening. Bear didn't move, didn't raise his hands, didn't show any sign of concern about Carlos's aggression. "Get off my land," Carlos said through gritted teeth. "Get off my land and don't come back." Bear nodded calmly. "I'll go," he said. "But I want Miss Martinez to know that if she ever decides she deserves better than this, I'll be at the Cattleman's Hotel in San Antonio for the next week. After that, I'm headed to Colorado, where there's work for someone with her skills and respect for someone with her beauty." He mounted Thunder with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, then touched his hat in a gesture of respect directed solely at Isabella. "Miss Martinez," he said formally, "it's been an honor." As Bear rode away, his massive frame gradually diminishing in the distance, Isabella stood frozen in place, her mind reeling with everything that had happened in the space of 20 minutes. A stranger had seen her, really seen her, and had declared her beautiful. He had challenged her father's version of reality so completely that she could no longer accept it as truth. Most importantly, he had offered her something she had never had before, a choice. Carlos was breathing heavily, his face still flushed with rage, his hands shaking with the aftermath of confrontation. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "If I ever catch you talking to that man again, if I ever see him on this property, there will be consequences you can't imagine. Do you understand me?" But Isabella was no longer the frightened girl who had awakened that morning. Something fundamental had changed in her, some internal shift that could never be reversed. She looked at her father with eyes that no longer held submission or fear, but something that might have been pity. "I understand," she said quietly. "I understand everything now." And for the first time in his life, Carlos Martinez realized that he might have pushed too hard, might have revealed too much of his own weakness, might have lost the one person whose opinion of him had mattered more than he was willing to admit. The battle for Isabella's soul wasn't over, but the first shot had been fired, and the ground beneath their feet had shifted in ways that neither of them fully comprehended. The evening that followed would force both father and daughter to confront truths they had spent years avoiding, and would set in motion events that would change their lives forever. The silence that settled over the Martinez ranch after Bear's departure was unlike any Isabella had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of evening settling over the land, nor the familiar hush that came with Carlos's brooding moods. This was the silence of a world fundamentally altered, where the very foundations of reality had been shaken and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, staring out her small window toward the road where Bear had disappeared hours earlier. The sun had set, painting the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded her painfully of the warmth she had seen in Bear's eyes when he looked at her. For 16 years, she had accepted Carlos's assessment of her worth as absolute truth. Now, in the span of a single afternoon, a stranger had challenged every assumption she had made about herself. Beautiful. The word echoed in her mind like a prayer or a promise. Bear had called her beautiful, had compared her to his beloved mother, had suggested that her mixed heritage was something to celebrate rather than hide. More than that, he had seen her intelligence, her competence, her dignity, all the qualities that Carlos systematically ignored or dismissed. Isabella rose from her bed and moved to the small mirror she kept hidden in her wardrobe, a piece of polished metal that she had salvaged from her mother's belongings years ago. For the first time in her life, she looked at her reflection, not with the critical eye Carlos had trained her to use, but with the possibility that Bear might be right. Her skin, which Carlos called too dark, gleamed like polished bronze in the lamplight. Her features, which he claimed marked her as inferior, seemed balanced and harmonious when she stopped looking for flaws. Her hair, which he insisted she keep covered and braided, fell in waves that caught the light like spun silk. Could it be possible that she was actually beautiful? Could 16 years of conditioning be wrong? The sound of Carlos's footsteps in the hallway outside her door made Isabella quickly hide the mirror and return to her bed. She had learned to track his movements by sound, to gauge his mood by the weight of his stride, to prepare herself for whatever criticism or lecture he might deliver. Tonight, his footsteps were slower than usual, almost hesitant, as if he too was grappling with the afternoon's revelations. Carlos stood outside Isabella's door for several minutes, his hand raised to knock, then lowering it again as he wrestled with words that wouldn't come. For 16 years, he had controlled every aspect of his daughter's life through a carefully constructed mythology of her inadequacy. That mythology had been challenged today in ways that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself and his motivations. When Bear had pointed out the hypocrisy of Carlos's position, that he condemned Isabella for traits they shared, it had forced him to confront truths he had spent decades avoiding. Carlos Martinez was a man who had built his entire identity around transcending his mixed heritage, around proving that he was more than the sum of his bloodlines. His success as a rancher, his accumulated wealth, his standing in the community, all of it was meant to demonstrate that he had risen above the circumstances of his birth. But Isabella's very existence threatened that narrative. She was living proof that he couldn't escape his heritage, couldn't breed it out of his bloodline, couldn't transform himself into something he fundamentally wasn't. More than that, her beauty, the beauty that Bear had recognized immediately, forced Carlos to acknowledge that there was nothing inherently inferior about their shared features. If Isabella was beautiful with her bronze skin and dark eyes, then perhaps Carlos's lifelong shame about his own appearance was misplaced. The realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure. Devastating because it meant that his treatment of Isabella had been based on self-hatred rather than legitimate concern for her welfare. Liberating because it suggested that the prison he had built around both of them might have walls that could be torn down. Carlos finally knocked on Isabella's door, a soft sound that carried none of his usual authority. "Isabella, can we talk?" Isabella's first instinct was to pretend to be asleep, to avoid whatever confrontation or lecture Carlos had planned. But Bear's words about deserving respect, about having the right to be heard, gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Come in," she said quietly. Carlos entered the room slowly, his usually commanding presence somehow diminished in the small space. He looked around as if seeing his daughter's room for the first time, the neat arrangement of her few possessions, the evidence of her careful management of her limited resources, the books she had hidden beneath her mattress that spoke of intellectual curiosity he had tried to suppress. "That man today," Carlos began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. "The things he said," Isabella waited, sensing that this conversation would be different from any they had shared before. For once, Carlos seemed genuinely uncertain, vulnerable in a way she had never witnessed. "Maybe I've been too harsh," Carlos continued, the admission clearly difficult for him. "Maybe I've been trying to protect you from things that aren't as dangerous as I believed them to be." The half-apology hung in the air between them, insufficient to heal 16 years of damage, but representing more acknowledgement of wrongdoing than Isabella had ever received from her father. She could accept it, could allow Carlos to save face while making minor adjustments to their relationship, could settle for this small admission rather than demanding the full recognition she deserved. But Bear's voice echoed in her memory, telling her she was worthy of more than scraps of respect grudgingly given. She was worthy of truth, of genuine acknowledgement, of a father who could see her clearly rather than through the distorted lens of his own shame. "Too harsh," Isabella said quietly. "Papa, you've spent 16 years telling me I was worthless. You've convinced me that my skin color made me inferior, that my heritage was something to be ashamed of, that no decent man would ever want me as a wife. That's not being too harsh. That's destroying your daughter's spirit because you hate yourself." Carlos flinched, as if she had struck him. "Isabella, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, surprising them both with her firmness. "You look at me and see everything you tried to escape from. My mother's Cherokee blood, our Mexican heritage, the poverty and prejudice you grew up with. You've been trying to convince me I'm worthless because admitting I'm beautiful would mean admitting that you're not the pure Spanish Don you pretend to be." The accuracy of her assessment left Carlos speechless. His daughter, The girl he had kept isolated and uneducated had seen through his carefully constructed facade with devastating clarity. She understood not just what he had done to her, but why he had done it, and the knowledge seemed to have given her a strength that he couldn't comprehend. "You've built this whole ranch, this whole life, around the idea that you're better than our blood," Isabella continued. "But what if our blood isn't something to be ashamed of? What if the Cherokee wisdom and strength that came from Mama's side, the resilience and passion that came from your Mexican ancestors, what if all of that is actually beautiful?" Carlos sank into the chair beside Isabella's bed, his usual commanding presence completely absent. "I wanted something better for you," he said weakly. "I wanted you to have opportunities I never had, to be accepted in ways I never was. By convincing me I was too inferior to deserve opportunities," Isabella challenged. "By isolating me from the world so I'd never discover my own worth? That's not protection, Papa. That's imprisonment." The word imprisonment hit Carlos like a physical blow. He had used similar language to justify his treatment of Isabella. She was being protected, sheltered, kept safe from a world that would judge her harshly. But hearing it described as imprisonment forced him to examine his motivations more honestly. "That man," Carlos said after a long silence, "he saw something in you that I've been blind to." "He saw me," Isabella replied simply. "Not his fears about me, not his projections of his own shame, not his plans for my future. He saw me as I actually am." Carlos looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in years. What he saw was a young woman of extraordinary beauty and dignity, someone who had survived 16 years of systematic undermining with her spirit intact. She had Carlos's determination and intelligence, Eleanor's grace and inner strength, and something entirely her own, a resilience that had allowed her to maintain her essential self despite everything he had done to destroy it. "You are beautiful," Carlos said quietly, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "You're as beautiful as your mother was. More beautiful, maybe, because you've got strength she never had to develop." Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of joy at finally receiving her father's approval. They were tears of grief for the years of self-doubt she had endured, for the confidence that had been systematically stripped away, and for the relationship with Carlos that might have been if he had been able to see her clearly from the beginning. "Thank you for saying that," she said carefully. "But it's not enough anymore." Carlos's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean that one moment of honesty doesn't undo 16 years of cruelty. I mean that telling me I'm beautiful now doesn't heal the damage done by telling me I was worthless for most of my life. I mean that I need more than your approval to rebuild what you helped destroy." The maturity and clarity of Isabella's response left Carlos reeling. This was not the broken, compliant girl he had shaped. This was a woman who understood her own worth, who could articulate the harm that had been done to her, who had somehow found the strength to demand genuine change rather than settling for token gestures. "What do you want from me?" Carlos asked, and for the first time in Isabella's memory, he sounded genuinely interested in her answer rather than preparing to argue with it. Isabella considered the question carefully. What did she want? She wanted her childhood back, the years of confidence and self-love that had been stolen from her. She wanted a father who had celebrated her beauty rather than hiding it, who had encouraged her dreams rather than crushing them, who had seen her heritage as a gift rather than a burden. But she couldn't have those things. The past was fixed, unchangeable, a collection of wounds that would always be part of her story. What she could have was a different future, one where her worth wasn't determined by Carlos's fears and projections. "I want the truth," she said finally. "Not just about my appearance, but about everything. I want to know why you really kept me isolated, why you forbade my education, why you've been planning to marry me off to men who would be grateful for someone with my defects. I want you to acknowledge that your treatment of me has been about your issues, not mine, Carlos was quiet for a long time, wrestling with the choice between maintaining his familiar lies and taking the risk of complete honesty. The lies had served him well for 16 years, had protected him from having to examine his own motivations too closely. But they had also cost him his daughter's trust and respect, and had nearly cost him the opportunity to know the remarkable woman she was becoming. "I was afraid," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "afraid that if you knew how beautiful you were, how intelligent, how capable, you'd leave me. Afraid that you'd discover there was a whole world out there where people like us could be accepted, where our heritage could be celebrated rather than hidden. Afraid that you'd realize you deserved better than what I could offer you here." The admission cost Carlos enormous effort, but it seemed to unlock something in him, as if speaking one truth made the next one easier. "I convinced myself I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself. I was terrified of being alone, of having to face my own failures without someone who needed me." Isabella absorbed this confession, recognizing the courage it had taken Carlos to make it, while also understanding that it was only the beginning of the reckoning between them. His honesty was necessary but not sufficient. Acknowledgement of harm was not the same as repairing it. "That man today," Isabella said carefully. "Bear, he offered me a choice. He said if I decided I deserved better than this, I could find him in San Antonio." Carlos's face went white. The possibility that Isabella might actually leave, might choose the stranger's vision of her future over the one Carlos had planned, struck him with terror. "You can't be serious. You don't know anything about him, about what he really wants." "I know that he looked at me and saw something worth fighting for," Isabella interrupted. "I know that he challenged your lies without asking for anything in return. I know that in 20 minutes of conversation, he gave me more respect and recognition than I've received from you in 16 years. Carlos started to protest, but Isabella held up her hand, stopping him with a gesture that carried surprising authority. "I'm not saying I'm going to run away with him. I'm not that foolish. But I am saying that for the first time in my life, I know I have choices. I know there are people in the world who won't see my skin color as a defect, who won't see my heritage as something to be ashamed of, who won't see me as a burden to be managed." She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the vast Texas landscape that had been both home and prison for her entire life. "The question now is whether you're willing to help me discover who I really am, or whether you're going to keep trying to make me into what you think I should be." Carlos stared at his daughter's silhouette against the window, recognizing that he was at a crossroads that would determine not just Isabella's future, but his own. He could continue trying to control and diminish her, could maintain the lies that had served him for so long, could lose her entirely to his own fear and selfishness, or he could choose to see her as Bear had seen her, as a masterpiece worthy of celebration rather than a mistake to be hidden. He could choose to be the father she deserved rather than the one his own wounds had made him. The choice would define the rest of both their lives. And as Carlos looked at the daughter, he was finally beginning to see clearly. He realized that some decisions could only be made with love rather than fear. The night was far from over, and there were conversations still to be had, truths still to be spoken, and wounds still to be acknowledged. But for the first time since Elena's death, Carlos Martinez allowed himself to hope that it might not be too late to save his relationship with his daughter, and perhaps his relationship with himself. 3 days passed after Bear's departure, but his presence lingered over the Martinez ranch like morning mist that refused to burn away under the Texas sun. The normal rhythm of farm life continued. Cattle needed tending, fences required repair, crops demanded attention, but underneath the familiar routines, both Carlos and Isabella moved through their days with the careful awareness of people navigating around an unexploded bomb. Carlos threw himself into physical labor, with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if he could sweat out the uncomfortable truths that Bear's visit had forced him to confront. He mended fences that didn't need mending, reorganized tools that were already perfectly arranged, and rode his property lines with the obsessive attention of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. But no amount of physical exertion could silence the voice in his head that sounded increasingly like Bear Sullivan, asking difficult questions about hypocrisy and self-hatred, about the difference between protection and control, about the damage done to Isabella in the name of keeping her safe. Isabella, meanwhile, moved through her daily chores with a new awareness of herself that was both liberating and terrifying. When she worked in the garden, she remembered Bear's genuine admiration for her skills. When she caught her reflection in windows or mirrors, she tried to see herself through his eyes rather than Carlos's. When she prepared meals or managed household accounts, she allowed herself to take pride in her competence rather than apologizing for her existence. The change in Isabella was subtle but unmistakable. She carried herself with more confidence, spoke with more authority when Carlos asked her questions, and most unsettling of all, she had begun to look him directly in the eye during conversations, rather than keeping her gaze fixed on the floor in the submissive posture he had trained into her. On the morning of the fourth day, Carlos made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of heading out to work in the fields as usual, he approached Isabella in the kitchen where she was kneading dough for the day's bread. "I want to take you into town," he said without preamble. Isabella's hands stilled on the dough. In her 16 years, Carlos had taken her to town fewer than a dozen times, and always with strict instructions about staying close to him, keeping her head down and speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. The idea of a voluntary trip to San Antonio filled her with equal parts excitement and anxiety. "Why?" she asked, not bothering to hide her suspicion. Carlos struggled to find words that would explain his motivation without revealing too much of his own internal turmoil. The truth was that Bear's accusations about Isabella's isolation had hit their mark. Carlos had convinced himself that keeping Isabella away from other people was protecting her from judgment and rejection, but he was beginning to suspect that his real motivation had been protecting himself from having to watch other people recognize her beauty and worth. "There are things you need," Carlos said finally. "Proper dresses. Books, maybe. Things a young woman should have." Isabella studied her father's face, searching for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. What she saw instead was something she had never witnessed before: genuine uncertainty. Carlos Martinez, who had ruled their household with absolute authority for as long as she could remember, looked nervous about taking his own daughter to town. "What's really happening here, Papa?" Isabella asked, using the childhood name she had abandoned years ago, but that seemed appropriate for this moment of unexpected vulnerability. "Why now? What's changed?" Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands fidgeting with the hat he held in his lap. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult admissions. "Maybe I've kept you too sheltered," he said carefully. "Maybe it's time you saw more of the world, met other people, had chances to be seen for who you are." The words cost him enormous effort, but Isabella recognized the significance of what he was offering. This wasn't just a trip to town. This was Carlos beginning to dismantle the walls he had built around her life, beginning to allow her the freedom to exist in the world beyond their ranch. "And if people stare?" Isabella asked, testing the sincerity of his offer. "If they judge me for my skin color, for looking too much like Mama's people?" Carlos's jaw tightened, but not with his usual anger. This was the tension of a man wrestling with his own prejudices, trying to separate his fears from reality. "Then they're fools," he said quietly, "and their opinion doesn't matter." Isabella felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. This was the first time Carlos had ever suggested that other people's prejudices might be their problem rather than hers. The first time he had implied that her appearance was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. "All right," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'd like to go to town." An hour later, Isabella sat beside Carlos on the buckboard wagon, watching the familiar landscape of their ranch give way to the broader world beyond their property lines. She had dressed carefully for this expedition, choosing her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out the warmth in her skin and made her dark eyes seem to sparkle with golden flecks. For the first time in years, she had left her hair uncovered, allowing it to catch the sunlight as it fell in waves over her shoulders. Carlos had noticed the changes in her appearance, but had said nothing, though Isabella caught him glancing at her with something that might have been surprise or pride, or perhaps fear of what this newly confident version of his daughter might choose to do with her life. The road to San Antonio was busier than Isabella remembered, with travelers and freight wagons creating a steady flow of commerce between the ranches and the growing city. As they drew closer to town, Isabella became aware of the attention their wagon was attracting. Men tipped their hats respectfully to Carlos, but their eyes lingered on Isabella with expressions she was only beginning to understand. These weren't looks of disgust or pity, the reactions Carlos had taught her to expect from strangers. These were looks of admiration, curiosity, and in some cases outright attraction. Isabella found herself sitting straighter, meeting these gazes with a confidence that would have been unthinkable just a week ago. San Antonio in the 1880s was a bustling frontier city, a mixture of Mexican, German, Anglo, and Native American influences that created a cultural richness Isabella had never experienced. The streets were alive with conversation in multiple languages. The scents of diverse cuisines mingled in the air, and everywhere she looked, Isabella saw people who shared various aspects of her heritage: bronze skin, dark hair, the distinctive features that Carlos had taught her to see as marks of inferiority. But here, in this cosmopolitan environment, those features weren't marks of shame. They were simply part of the beautiful diversity that made up the fabric of Texas society. Isabella saw Mexican women dressed in fine clothes, walking arm in arm with their husbands, saw Native American traders conducting business with Anglo merchants, saw children of obviously mixed heritage playing together in the streets without anyone treating them as curiosities or outcasts. "It's not what I expected," Isabella said quietly as they made their way through the busy streets toward the general store. "What did you expect?" Carlos asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Stares, whispers, people treating me like I didn't belong," Isabella replied honestly. "That's what you always said would happen if I went places where people could see me." Carlos was silent, forced to confront the reality that his predictions about Isabella's reception had been based more on his own insecurities than on actual experience. The people they encountered in San Antonio were too busy with their own lives to pay particular attention to one more beautiful young woman. And when they did notice Isabella, their reactions were uniformly positive. At the general store, the proprietor's wife, a kind-faced German woman named Mrs. Hoffman, took one look at Isabella and immediately began showing her bolts of fabric that would complement her coloring. "You have such lovely skin, dear," Mrs. Hoffman said without a trace of condescension. "These jewel tones will be perfect with your complexion. Your father is wise to bring you in for proper dresses. A young lady as beautiful as you deserves clothes that show her off properly." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it was the flush of pleasure rather than shame. Carlos watched this interaction with growing bewilderment, seeing his daughter receive the kind of positive attention he had convinced himself she would never experience. From the general store, they visited the bookshop, where the elderly proprietor immediately recognized Isabella's intelligence and began recommending volumes that would challenge and educate her. "A mind as sharp as yours deserves proper feeding," he said, pressing books into her hands with the enthusiasm of someone who understood the hunger for knowledge. At the millinery shop, the seamstress took Isabella's measurements for new dresses with professional admiration for her figure and bearing. "You carry yourself like a queen, miss," the woman said. "These dresses will help you look the part." With each positive interaction, Isabella felt herself expanding, growing into a version of herself she had never been allowed to imagine. She was intelligent, beautiful, worthy of respect and admiration. The world beyond her father's ranch was not the hostile place she had been taught to fear, but a place where she could thrive. But the most significant moment of the day came when they stopped at the Cattleman's Hotel for lunch. Isabella's heart raced as they approached the establishment, where Bear had said he would be staying, though she tried to maintain an outward appearance of calm. She told herself that she was simply curious to see if he was still in town, that their brief encounter couldn't possibly have meant as much to him as it had to her. The hotel's dining room was crowded with ranchers, merchants, and travelers, creating a buzz of conversation that provided cover for Isabella's racing thoughts. She and Carlos had been seated at a corner table and were studying their menus when a familiar voice made Isabella's heart skip. "Mr. Martinez. Miss Martinez." Isabella looked up to find Bear Sullivan standing beside their table, his impressive height making him impossible to miss even in the crowded room. He had cleaned up since their last meeting. His clothes were pressed, his hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged wherever he chose to be. But what struck Isabella most powerfully was the way his face lit up when he saw her. There was no mistaking the genuine pleasure in his expression, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him as he looked at her. This was not a man who had forgotten their encounter or dismissed it as unimportant. This was a man who had been hoping to see her again. Carlos's reaction was more complicated. Part of him wanted to stand up and order Bear away from their table, to protect the fragile progress he and Isabella had made by keeping this disruptive influence out of their lives. But another part of him, the part that had watched Isabella bloom under positive attention all morning, recognized that Bear's presence made his daughter happy in a way that Carlos had never been able to achieve. "Mr. Sullivan," Carlos said carefully, half rising from his seat in a gesture of grudging respect. "I didn't expect to see you still in town." "I'm heading out tomorrow," Bear replied, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "But I'm mighty glad I had the chance to see Miss Martinez again. You look beautiful, miss, if you don't mind me saying so." Isabella felt the familiar flutter in her chest that Bear's compliments always produced. But this time it was accompanied by something new, the confidence to accept praise gracefully rather than deflecting it with self-deprecation. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Sullivan." The simple exchange carried undercurrents that all three of them recognized, but none acknowledged directly. This was more than polite conversation between acquaintances. This was a moment of connection that had the potential to change everything. Carlos watched his daughter and the giant cowboy look at each other with something that resembled recognition, as if they were seeing something in each other that the rest of the world had missed. For the first time, Carlos began to understand that Isabella's future might not be entirely within his control, that she was becoming a woman with her own desires and choices, and that those choices might not align with his plans for her life. The question now was whether he would try to maintain control through manipulation and fear, or whether he would trust his daughter to make her own decisions about her future. As he watched Bear and Isabella smile at each other with obvious mutual admiration, Carlos realized that his choice would determine not just Isabella's happiness, but his own relationship with the remarkable woman his daughter was becoming. The afternoon was far from over, and there were conversations still to be had that would reshape all their lives. The conversation that followed Bear's appearance at their table carried the weight of unspoken possibilities. Carlos found himself in the unprecedented position of watching his daughter interact with a man as an equal, not as someone seeking his approval or permission, but as a woman capable of making her own judgments about people and relationships. Please, join us, Isabella said, gesturing to an empty chair at their table before Carlos could object. The invitation was extended with natural grace, as if entertaining suitors was something she had been doing all her life, rather than something she was experiencing for the first time. Bear accepted gratefully, removing his hat and settling his impressive frame into the chair with the careful movements of someone who had learned to navigate a world built for smaller men. "I hope I'm not intruding on family time," he said, addressing Carlos with respectful deference while making it clear that his primary attention was focused on Isabella. "Not at all," Isabella replied, again before Carlos could respond. "We were just finishing lunch. Papa brought me to town to shop for new dresses and books." Carlos noticed the subtle shift in dynamics immediately. Isabella was conducting this conversation herself, speaking for both of them rather than waiting for his permission or guidance. A week ago, such behavior would have triggered his immediate anger. Today, watching her navigate the social situation with poise and confidence, he found himself oddly proud of her composure. "New dresses and books," Bear repeated, his eyes lighting up with genuine interest. "That sounds like someone preparing for new adventures. Are you planning to expand your world, Miss Martinez?" The question carried implications that all three of them understood, but that only Isabella was prepared to address directly. "I'm beginning to think my world has been smaller than it needed to be," she said carefully. "Today has been educational." Bear's smile was warm and encouraging. "And what have you learned?" Isabella glanced at Carlos, checking his reaction before continuing. What she saw in her father's face was not the anger or disapproval she expected, but something that looked almost like curiosity about her answer. "I've learned that people aren't as judgmental as I was taught to expect," Isabella said slowly. "I've learned that the world is bigger and more welcoming than I knew. And I've learned that maybe some of the limitations I accepted as permanent might actually be choices." Carlos felt the words like physical blows, recognizing his own role in teaching Isabella to expect judgment and rejection, in convincing her that her limitations were inherent rather than imposed. But instead of the defensive anger that would normally accompany such recognition, he found himself feeling something closer to shame, not for Isabella, but for himself. Bear leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on Isabella's words. "Those are important discoveries," he said seriously. "What do you plan to do with them?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities that could reshape all their lives. Isabella looked at Bear, seeing in his eyes the same genuine interest and respect she had encountered from him during their first meeting. Then she looked at Carlos, seeing for the first time something that might have been hope rather than fear. "I don't know yet," Isabella said honestly. "I'm still figuring out what choices I actually have." Bear nodded understandingly. "Choices take time to consider properly. But I want you to know that the offer I made before still stands. There's work in Colorado for someone with your skills, respect for someone with your character, and appreciation for someone with your beauty. It's not just an escape from what you've known. It's a chance to discover what you might become." Carlos's hands tightened on his coffee cup, but he didn't interrupt. The old Carlos would have exploded at such direct courting of his daughter, would have ordered Bear away from their table and forbidden Isabella from further contact with him. But the events of the past week had forced Carlos to confront the possibility that his protective instincts had been more destructive than helpful. "And what exactly are you offering my daughter?" Carlos asked, his voice carefully controlled. Bear turned to address Carlos directly, man to man, with the respect due to a father, even when that father had failed in his duties. "I'm offering her a chance to be valued for who she is, rather than limited by who she's been told she should be. I'm offering her work that would challenge her intelligence, a community that would appreciate her contributions." And he paused, his eyes returning to Isabella. "The possibility of being loved by someone who sees her clearly. The word loved hung in the air like a declaration of war or a promise of peace, depending on how it was received. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat, while Carlos felt the familiar panic of losing control over his daughter's future. But before Carlos could respond, Isabella spoke. "Mr. Sullivan, you barely know me. How can you speak of love?" Bear considered her question seriously, understanding that his answer would determine whether she saw him as genuine or merely infatuated. "You're right that I don't know all the details of your life, all the experiences that have shaped you. But I know what I see when I look at you. I see strength that has survived years of being told you were weak. I see beauty that shines despite being hidden. I see intelligence that has flourished without proper education. I see dignity that has endured systematic undermining." He paused, his voice growing softer but more intense. "Those qualities don't develop by accident, Miss Martinez. They develop in someone who has an unshakable core of goodness, someone who refuses to let circumstances destroy their essential self. That's the kind of person worth knowing completely, worth loving fully, worth building a life with." Isabella stared at Bear, overwhelmed by his assessment of her character. No one had ever described her in such terms, had ever suggested that her struggles had created strength rather than damage, had ever implied that her experiences had made her more rather than less valuable. Carlos watched his daughter's reaction to Bear's words, seeing something in her expression that he had never witnessed before. This wasn't the desperate gratitude of someone accepting whatever scraps of affection were offered. This was the recognition of someone seeing herself clearly reflected in another person's eyes for the first time. "Papa," Isabella said, turning to Carlos with an expression that combined love and determination in equal measure. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Carlos nodded, though he suspected that whatever Isabella was about to ask would force him into admissions he wasn't prepared to make. "If I chose to go to Colorado with Mr. Sullivan, if I chose to build a life somewhere else with someone who values me, would you try to stop me?" The question cut to the heart of everything that had changed between them over the past week. A month ago, Carlos would have answered without hesitation that of course he would stop her, that she belonged to him until he decided to give her to someone else, that her choices were his to make until he transferred that authority to a husband of his choosing. But the events of the past week had forced Carlos to confront the possibility that Isabella was not his property to dispose of, but a person with her own right to self-determination. More than that, he was beginning to understand that his attempts to control her had been driven not by love, but by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of admitting his own failures, fear of facing the world alone. "I don't know," Carlos said finally, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "A week ago, I would have said yes, absolutely. I would have locked you in your room before I let you leave with a stranger. And now?" Isabella prompted gently. Carlos looked at his daughter, really seeing her for perhaps the first time in years. What he saw was a woman who had survived his worst impulses and emerged stronger, who had maintained her essential goodness despite his systematic attempts to convince her she was worthless, who had grown into someone remarkable despite rather than because of his guidance. "Now I think maybe your choices should be yours to make," he said quietly. "I think maybe I've been so afraid of losing you that I never gave you a chance to choose to stay." The admission cost Carlos enormous effort, but it seemed to unlock something in Isabella's expression, a softening that suggested forgiveness might be possible even if trust would take longer to rebuild. "I'm not ready to make that choice yet," Isabella said carefully. "This is all happening very fast, and there are things I need to understand about myself before I can decide what I want my future to look like." Bear nodded respectfully. "Of course. I wouldn't want you to make a decision that important without taking time to consider all aspects of it. But I would like to know more," Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'd like to know about Colorado, about the work you mentioned, about what kind of life would be possible there." "I'd be honored to tell you anything you want to know," Bear replied. "And I'd be grateful for the chance to learn more about you as well, about your thoughts and dreams and what you hope for from life." Carlos watched this exchange with growing understanding of how fundamentally his relationship with Isabella had changed. She was no longer asking his permission to be curious about her options. She was informing him of her intentions while giving him the courtesy of advance notice. "There's something else," Isabella said, looking between Bear and Carlos. "If I'm going to consider making such a big decision, I need to know that both of you can be honest with me about your motivations and expectations." She turned to Carlos first. "Papa, I need you to tell me the truth about why you've kept me isolated, why you've convinced me I was worthless, why you've planned to marry me off to men who would be grateful for damaged goods. Not the version where you were protecting me, but the real truth about your fears and your shame." Carlos flinched at the directness of her demand, but he recognized that evasion was no longer possible. Isabella had moved beyond accepting his rationalizations and was demanding accountability for his actions. "I was ashamed," Carlos said quietly. "Ashamed of my own heritage, ashamed of looking too much like my Mexican ancestors, ashamed of never being fully accepted by the Anglo ranchers, no matter how successful I became. When you were born looking more like your mother than like me, you became a reminder of everything I was trying to escape from." He paused, gathering courage for the hardest part of his confession. "I convinced myself that if I could make you small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, maybe I could protect both of us from judgment. But the truth is, I was trying to protect myself from having to defend you, from having to admit that beauty and worth could exist in features I had been taught to see as inferior." Isabella absorbed this admission, recognizing both the courage it had taken Carlos to make it and the damage his shame had inflicted on their relationship. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said simply. Then she turned to Bear. "And I need the same honesty from you, Mr. Sullivan. What do you really want from me? What are you hoping will happen if I come to Colorado with you?" Bear met her gaze directly, understanding that his answer would determine whether she saw him as trustworthy or merely another man trying to control her life for his own benefit. "I want the chance to know you completely," he said without hesitation. "I want to discover what makes you laugh, what makes you angry, what dreams you have for your life. I want to be the kind of partner who helps you become everything you're capable of being, rather than someone who limits you to fit his own needs." He paused, his voice growing more intense. "And yes, I hope you'll fall in love with me the way I'm already falling in love with you. But I want that love to be a choice you make freely, based on knowing me as I really am, not a decision forced by desperation or limited options." Isabella felt her heart race at his declaration, but she also felt the solid ground of genuine respect beneath his romantic interest. This was not a man trying to rescue her from her circumstances so she would be grateful enough to accept whatever he offered. This was a man who saw her potential and wanted to help her realize it. "I need time," Isabella said finally. "Time to think, time to understand what I really want, time to decide what kind of life I want to build for myself." "How much time?" Bear asked gently. Isabella looked at Carlos, seeing in his expression a mixture of hope and fear that suggested he was genuinely trying to support her right to choose, rather than manipulating the situation. "To achieve his preferred outcome, give me 2 weeks," she said. 2 weeks to explore who I am when I'm not being told who I should be. 2 weeks to decide what I want my future to look like." Bear nodded solemnly. 2 weeks, and then I'll give you my answer," Isabella replied. "Whatever it is, I'll give it freely, based on what I've discovered about myself and what I want from life." The agreement hung between them, a promise that would determine the course of all their lives. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Isabella realized that for the first time in her 16 years, her future was truly her own to decide. The next 2 weeks would determine not just where she would live or whom she would marry, but who she would become as a woman, free to make her own choices about love, work, family, and identity. The girl who had been told she was too dark to deserve happiness was about to discover what happened when she chose to believe in her own worth instead. The 2 weeks that followed Isabella's declaration of independence became the most transformative period of her young life. For the first time since early childhood, she woke each morning not to a list of prescribed tasks and limitations, but to the exhilarating and terrifying freedom of choosing how to spend her time, what to think about, and who she wanted to become. Carlos, true to his word, had stepped back from his role as controller and critic. The change in him was so dramatic that Isabella sometimes caught herself staring at him in wonderment, as if her father had been replaced by a stranger who looked exactly like him, but possessed an entirely different personality. Gone were the daily reminders about her inadequacy, the criticism disguised as protection, the systematic undermining of her confidence. In their place was something Isabella had never experienced from Carlos before: respect for her autonomy. The first morning of her new freedom, Isabella stood before her bedroom mirror, not the hidden fragment she had used for secret self-examination, but a proper mirror that Carlos had purchased during their trip to San Antonio and installed in her room without fanfare or explanation. For the first time in years, she could see herself completely, and what she saw took her breath away. The young woman reflected back at her was not the flawed, unmarriageable girl Carlos had described for 16 years. This was someone with striking beauty, bronze skin that seemed to glow with inner warmth, dark eyes that held depths of intelligence and feeling, hair that fell in lustrous waves around features that were harmonious and distinctive. This was Elena Blackhorse's daughter, carrying her mother's Cherokee dignity and grace, combined with the Martinez determination and strength. But more than physical beauty, Isabella saw something in her reflection that was entirely new: the beginning of self-possession. For the first time in her memory, she was looking at herself through her own eyes, rather than through the distorted lens of Carlos's shame and fear. What she saw was worthy of admiration, worthy of love, worthy of every good thing life might offer. Isabella's days, during these 2 weeks, took on a rhythm entirely different from the rigid schedule that had previously governed her life. She still tended the garden, still managed the household, still fulfilled her responsibilities, but now she did these things as choices rather than obligations, with pride rather than resignation. In the afternoons, when the Texas heat made outdoor work impossible, Isabella devoted herself to the books Carlos had purchased for her in San Antonio. She read voraciously, novels that opened her imagination to possibilities she had never considered, histories that placed her heritage in a broader context of courage and achievement, books about other places where people like her had built successful lives. Each book was a revelation, expanding her understanding of what was possible for a woman of her background and abilities. She read about Mexican women who had become successful businesswomen, about Cherokee leaders who had negotiated treaties with governments, about mixed heritage individuals who had excelled in fields ranging from medicine to politics to the arts. The world, she discovered, was full of people who looked like her and had refused to accept limitations based on their ancestry. But perhaps most importantly, Isabella used these 2 weeks to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under years of systematic discouragement. She began singing again, not just humming while she worked, but actually singing the songs her mother had taught her before Elena's death. Her voice, unused for years except in whispered lullabies to herself, proved to be rich and clear, with a quality that seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the house. Carlos, hearing his daughter's voice raised in song for the first time in over a decade, found himself stopping his work to listen, transported back to evenings when Elena would sing the same melodies while preparing dinner or tending to baby Isabella. Instead of the pain these memories had once brought him, Carlos felt something closer to gratitude for the reminder of the beauty he had once been privileged to share. Isabella also began to explore her artistic abilities, discovering that she had inherited not just her mother's voice, but also her grandmother's skill with needle and thread. The simple dresses she had been allowed to wear for years gave way to garments she modified and embellished herself, adding embroidery that reflected Cherokee patterns she remembered from childhood, using colors that complemented rather than concealed her natural beauty. Each small act of self-expression was an act of rebellion against the years of enforced invisibility, a declaration that Isabella Martinez was not too dark, too Indian, too much of anything to deserve beauty and joy in her life. She was exactly as she was meant to be, and that was something to celebrate rather than hide. The most significant change, however, was in Isabella's relationship with other people. Word had spread through the community about the Martinez girl's transformation, about how she had accompanied her father to San Antonio, how she had been seen talking confidently with merchants and shopkeepers, how she had emerged from years of isolation looking like a young woman ready to take on the world. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged Isabella's existence for years began finding excuses to visit the ranch, curious to see this remarkable transformation for themselves. What they found was a young woman who could discuss everything from agricultural techniques to literature, who could sing beautifully, who could manage complex household operations with impressive efficiency, and who carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, whose ranch bordered the Martinez property, became Isabella's first real friend among her own generation. Elena was a widow only 5 years older than Isabella, who had been managing her late husband's ranch with skill that had earned the grudging respect of the male-dominated ranching community. "You know," Elena told Isabella during one of their conversations, "I've been watching your father keep you hidden away for years, and I always wondered what he was so afraid of. Now I understand. He was afraid that if people saw you, they'd realize what a treasure he'd been, wasting." Elena's friendship provided Isabella with something she had never experienced before, the perspective of another young woman who had faced similar challenges and overcome them. Elena had dealt with men who questioned her ability to manage a ranch, had faced neighbors who thought a woman should remarry rather than remain independent, had overcome prejudices about her Mexican heritage in a community that sometimes valued Anglo connections above competence. "The secret," Elena confided, "is knowing your own worth, regardless of what other people think. Some people will always have opinions about women like us, too dark, too independent, too much of whatever they think we should be less of. But their opinions only matter if we let them." These conversations were revelatory for Isabella, who had spent years believing that her father's negative assessment of her was shared by the entire world. Discovering that other people, particularly other women who shared aspects of her heritage, had faced similar challenges and emerged stronger, gave her hope that her own transformation was not just possible but sustainable. The most surprising development during these 2 weeks was the gradual healing of Isabella's relationship with Carlos. Without the dynamic of constant criticism and defensive reaction, father and daughter began to discover that they actually enjoyed each other's company. Carlos, no longer expending energy on maintaining his mythology of Isabella's inadequacy, revealed himself to be intelligent, funny, and surprisingly well-informed about subjects ranging from literature to politics. Isabella, no longer crushed under the weight of constant disapproval, showed Carlos aspects of her personality he had never been allowed to see. She was witty, thoughtful, and possessed of strong opinions about everything from ranch management to social justice. Their evening conversations, once tense affairs focused on Isabella's supposed shortcomings, became genuine exchanges of ideas between two intelligent people who happened to be related. "You know, Carlos told Isabella one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." It was the first time Carlos had voluntarily mentioned Elena in years, and the first time he had ever suggested that Isabella's resemblance to her mother was something positive rather than problematic. "Tell me about her," Isabella said quietly. "Really tell me, not just the few stories you've shared before. Tell me who she was as a person." Carlos was silent for a long moment, gathering memories he had buried under years of grief and shame. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth Isabella had never heard before. "Elena was the strongest person I've ever known," he said. "Not just physically, though she could work alongside any man on this ranch. Strong in her spirit, in her sense of who she was and what she believed in. She never apologized for her heritage, never tried to make herself smaller to fit other people's expectations." He paused, looking directly at Isabella. "She would have been appalled by what I've done to you. She would have fought me tooth and nail before letting me convince you that there was anything wrong with looking like her people, with carrying her blood, with being exactly who you were born to be." Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were tears of healing rather than pain. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why did you let me think she would have been ashamed of me?" Carlos's voice broke slightly as he answered. "Because admitting she would have been proud of you meant admitting that I had failed her. It meant acknowledging that everything I'd done, in the name of protecting you, had actually been about protecting myself from having to face my own shame and grief." The admission hung between them, heavy with the weight of years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. But instead of the anger Isabella might have felt a few weeks earlier, she found herself feeling something closer to compassion for the broken man her father had been. "We can't change the past," Isabella said gently. "But we can choose what happens next." Carlos nodded, understanding that his daughter was offering him something precious: forgiveness, conditional on his continued commitment to seeing her clearly and supporting her choices. As the 2 weeks drew to a close, Isabella found herself facing the decision that would determine the rest of her life with a clarity she had never expected to achieve. The frightened, uncertain girl who had agreed to consider Bear's offer had been replaced by a young woman who understood her own worth, who had tested her ability to thrive in the wider world, who had rebuilt her relationship with her father on terms of mutual respect. The question was no longer whether she was worthy of love and opportunity. She knew she was. The question was what she wanted to do with the life she was finally free to live on her own terms. Bear had written twice during the 2 weeks, brief letters that respected her need for space while keeping her informed about his plans and his feelings. His final letter had arrived that morning, reminding her that he would be leaving San Antonio the next day and asking if she had reached a decision about Colorado. As Isabella sat in her transformed bedroom, surrounded by books and sewing projects and evidence of the woman she was becoming, she realized that the choice before her was not just about Bear or Colorado, or even about leaving home. It was about choosing who she wanted to be for the rest of her life. The girl who had been told she was too dark to deserve happiness was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and was ready to claim her place in the world. Now she had to decide exactly what that place would be. The morning of decision dawned clear and bright over the Martinez ranch, with the kind of crystalline Texas sky that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. Isabella woke before sunrise, not from anxiety but from excitement, the anticipation of someone about to step fully into their own life for the first time. She dressed carefully in one of the dresses she had modified during her 2 weeks of transformation, a deep emerald green that brought out the golden flecks in her dark eyes and complemented the warm bronze of her skin. Her hair, no longer hidden beneath scarves or severe braids, fell in loose waves around her shoulders, catching the early morning light like spun silk. Standing before her mirror, Isabella saw not the girl who had been told she was too dark to deserve happiness, but a woman who knew her own worth and was ready to claim her place in the world. The reflection that looked back at her radiated confidence, intelligence, and a beauty that came from within as much as from her striking features. Carlos was already in the kitchen when Isabella came downstairs, and the sight of him preparing breakfast, a task he had left entirely to her for years, spoke volumes about how fundamentally their relationship had changed. He looked up when she entered, and his expression held something she had never seen there before, unqualified pride in his daughter. "You look beautiful." "Mija," he said simply, using the endearment he had abandoned when Isabella was still a child. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Isabella felt warmth spread through her chest at the words, not because she needed Carlos's validation, but because they represented a healing she had never thought possible. "Thank you, Papa. That means everything to me." They shared breakfast in comfortable silence, both understanding that this meal marked the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. Whatever Isabella decided about her future, their relationship would never again be based on fear, control, and systematic undermining. They had found their way back to love, even if that love would have to adapt to new circumstances. "Have you decided?" Carlos asked as they finished eating. Isabella nodded. "I have. But I want to tell you both my decision at the same time. Will you come with me to town?" Carlos's eyes widened slightly. "You want me there when you give Sullivan your answer?" "I want you there because you're my father, and despite everything that's happened between us, I love you. I want you to be part of this moment, whatever direction it takes." Carlos felt his throat tighten with emotion. 6 weeks ago, Isabella had been a broken girl who couldn't meet his eyes. Now she was a confident woman who was choosing to include him in the most important decision of her life. Not because she needed his permission, but because she valued his presence. "I would be honored to be there," he said quietly. An hour later, father and daughter rode into San Antonio together. Their relationship transformed from captor and prisoner to allies facing the future as a team. Isabella sat straight and proud on the wagon seat, her bearing that of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. Carlos, meanwhile, found himself experiencing something entirely new. Genuine excitement about his daughter's prospects rather than fear of losing her. The Cattleman's Hotel was bustling with its usual mixture of travelers, ranchers and businessmen when Isabella and Carlos arrived. As they entered the lobby, Isabella felt eyes turn toward her, but instead of the shame such attention had once provoked, she felt only quiet satisfaction. People were noticing her because she was worth noticing. Not because there was something wrong with her. Bear was waiting in the hotel's dining room, his impressive height making him impossible to miss, even in the crowded space. When he saw Isabella enter, his face lit up with the same wonder and admiration she remembered from their first meeting. But now there was something deeper in his expression, respect for the journey she had undertaken and curiosity about the decision she had reached. "Miss Martinez," Bear said, rising to greet them both. "Mr. Martinez, thank you for coming." Isabella studied Bear's face, seeing in it the same genuine warmth and respect that had first challenged her father's version of reality. This was a man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had offered her choices when she didn't know she had any, who had spoken of love while respecting her need to choose freely. "Mr. Sullivan," Isabella said, settling into the chair he held for her. "I've reached my decision." Bear sat across from her, his hands folded calmly on the table, his expression attentive but without the desperate hope that might have made Isabella feel pressured. "I'm listening." Isabella took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts for words that would reshape multiple lives. 2 weeks ago, you offered me a choice between staying in a life that was slowly killing my spirit and coming to Colorado to discover what I might become. At the time, I thought those were my only options." She paused, her gaze moving between Bear and Carlos. "But during these past 2 weeks, I've discovered something important. The choice isn't really between staying and leaving. The choice is between living in fear and living in truth. Bear nodded slowly, beginning to understand the depth of Isabella's transformation. For 16 years, I believed lies about myself, that I was too dark, too inferior, too much of a burden to deserve love or respect or opportunities. Those lies shaped everything about how I moved through the world, what I thought I deserved, what I dared to hope for. Isabella's voice grew stronger as she spoke. But you helped me understand that those lies weren't truth. They were my father's fears projected onto me, his shame about his own heritage transferred to me, his terror of abandonment disguised as protection. Carlos flinched slightly at the accurate assessment, but he didn't interrupt. This was Isabella's moment to speak her truth, whatever it might be. The woman I've discovered I am during these 2 weeks is someone who can succeed anywhere she chooses to be, Isabella continued. Someone whose intelligence, skills, and character make her valuable in any community. Someone whose heritage is a source of strength rather than shame. She looked directly at Bear, her dark eyes holding his blue ones steadily. I'm deeply grateful for your offer, Mr. Sullivan. Your faith in me gave me the courage to discover my own worth, and your respect gave me the space to make this decision freely. You are a good man who deserves a woman who can love you completely and without reservation. Bear's expression began to shift, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. But I've realized that I don't need to be rescued from my circumstances, Isabella said gently. I need to transform them. I don't need to escape from my life. I need to remake it into something worthy of the woman I've discovered I am. Bear absorbed this with the grace of a man who had hoped for a different answer but respected Isabella's right to choose her own path. You're staying, he said quietly. I'm staying, Isabella confirmed, but not as the powerless girl who was hidden away on her father's ranch. I'm staying as Isabella Martinez, a woman who knows her own worth and intends to build a life that reflects it. She turned to Carlos, including him in her explanation. My friend Elena has offered to make me a partner in her ranch. Together, we plan to develop it into the most successful operation in South Texas. I've also been asked to teach at the new school being established in town. Apparently, news of my education and abilities has spread. Carlos's eyes widened with surprise and pride. His daughter wasn't just choosing to stay. She was choosing to build an extraordinary life right here, using talents he had tried to suppress for years. Additionally, Isabella continued, I plan to establish a program to help other young women who have been told they are too dark, too different, too much of something to deserve opportunities. I want to create chances for girls like me to discover their worth before they lose years believing lies about themselves. Bear listened to this recital of Isabella's plans with growing admiration. This was not a woman settling for safety over adventure. This was a woman who had found adventure in transformation, who had chosen to become an agent of change rather than a victim of circumstances. That sounds like an extraordinary life, Bear said sincerely. And you sound like an extraordinary woman who will make it happen, Isabella smiled, feeling genuine warmth toward this man who had catalyzed her transformation, even though she couldn't give him what he hoped for. What about you? Will you still go to Colorado? Bear was quiet for a moment, considering his options in light of Isabella's decision. I think so, he said finally. But I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, if you ever decide you want to see what Colorado has to offer, you'll always be welcome there. And I want you to know, Isabella replied, that if you ever decide you'd like to see what South Texas has to offer, you'll always be welcome here. A man with your character and abilities would be valued in our community. The exchange carried the warmth of genuine respect and affection, even as it acknowledged that their paths would diverge. Bear had given Isabella the gift of seeing herself clearly, and she had given him the gift of knowing that such recognition was possible, that somewhere in the world was a woman capable of appreciating his worth. Carlos, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Mr. Sullivan, I owe you an apology and a debt I can never repay. You saw my daughter's worth when I was blind to it, and you helped her discover her own value when I was actively destroying it. You're a better man than I've been, and Isabella is a better woman than I deserved to raise." Bear accepted the apology with the same grace he had shown throughout their acquaintance. "Mr. Martinez, it takes courage to acknowledge past mistakes and wisdom to change course. Isabella didn't become who she is despite your influence. She became who she is because she has your strength and determination, combined with her mother's dignity and grace. You both contributed to raising a remarkable woman." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes at Bear's generous assessment. He could have used this moment to underscore Carlos's failures, but instead he was choosing to highlight the positive influences that had shaped her. This generosity of spirit reminded her why she had been drawn to him, even as it confirmed her decision not to follow him to Colorado. "There's one more thing," Isabella said, looking between the two men who had played such crucial roles in her transformation. "I want both of you to know that this story, my story, isn't ending today. It's beginning. The girl who was told she was too dark to deserve happiness is gone forever. But the woman who knows she deserves everything good that life can offer is just getting started." She stood, and both men rose with her, recognizing the formal conclusion of this phase of their relationship. "Mr. Sullivan, I wish you every happiness in Colorado. May you find a woman who appreciates your worth as much as you appreciated mine." Bear took her hand briefly, his touch warm and respectful. "And I wish you every success in building the life you've envisioned, Miss Martinez. The world needs more women like you, women who refuse to be diminished, who transform pain into power, who choose to lift others rather than tear them down." Isabella turned to Carlos, seeing in his eyes a mixture of regret for lost years and excitement about future possibilities. "Papa, are you ready to help me build something extraordinary?" Carlos nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent 16 years trying to make you smaller. I'd like to spend whatever years I have left helping you become as large as your dreams." As the three of them parted ways outside the hotel, Bear to prepare for his journey to Colorado, Isabella and Carlos to return to their ranch and begin planning their new ventures, Isabella felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with romantic fulfillment and everything to do with finally becoming who she was meant to be. 6 weeks ago, she had been a girl broken by lies about her inadequacy. Today, she was a woman empowered by truth about her worth. The transformation had required courage from her, honesty from Carlos, and recognition from Bear. But ultimately, it had been her choice to reject the poisonous mythology that had shaped her early years and embrace the powerful reality of who she actually was. As their wagon rolled away from San Antonio toward home, Isabella began singing, not the quiet, hidden melodies of her captivity, but the full-throated songs of celebration that her Cherokee grandmother had taught her mother, that Eleanor had passed on to her, and that she would someday teach to other young women who needed to discover their own voices. Carlos listened to his daughter's singing with wonder and gratitude, finally understanding that the most beautiful music came not from trying to silence what made people different, but from helping them find the courage to let their authentic selves ring out clear and strong. The girl who had been too dark was gone forever, replaced by a woman who was exactly as luminous as she was meant to be. And in choosing to shine where she was planted rather than seeking validation elsewhere, Isabella Martinez had discovered the most important truth of all, that worthiness was not something external to be earned or granted, but something internal to be recognized and claimed. Her story was just beginning, and it would be magnificent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.